Hello and welcome to the latest of my deep dive videos. Today I'm going to explore the retrograde of the mighty but the tiny Pluto, which begins on the 1st of May 2023 and concludes after 5 months and 10 days on the 11th of October. But on the 11th of June, Pluto inverses from the sign of Aquarius and into the sign of Capricorn. It will return to the sign of Aquarius on the 21st of January 2024, which is hugely symbolic. This is because Pluto was discovered in 1930 on the 21st of January, not the 18th of February, as is often reported. What does Pluto retrograde represent? Why is it particularly impactful for anyone who's born early in a fixed sign or very late in a cardinal sign? I'm going to share that with you too. But the themes is something I'm going to really dive into, immerse myself with, to share with you. I'm then going to take a brief look at the event chart from a solar perspective, with Pluto beginning the retrograde in house 11, moving into house 10 on the 11th of June, and also see where the other planetary influences are impacting on this event. There's a really big duo. One is the moon's opposition with Neptune, the other is the midpoint between the sun and the moon, cresting on Mars in the sign of Cancer. Then I'm going to take a look at the solar chart. What's particularly relevant there is that Pluto's in house 4, very much about where we live, how we live there, our emotional needs, of course family, and to do with security. That's really intriguing. I'm then going to outline each of the key aspects that Pluto forges between now and the 11th of October. There are 5, and they are incredibly intense. Finally, I'm going to dive into each of the 12 zodiac signs to give you a flavour of what you can expect over that period of time. Now, if you would like to understand what Pluto in Aquarius means, I've had 28,000 views on my first video. Please see the link below if you want to explore that in a more exclusive way. So thank you so much for joining me. If you're a returning visitor, it's great to have you with me once more. If you're new here, I'd be honoured if you would subscribe. Please click or tap on the bell notification symbol. Also, if you would like to get your free daily horoscope fired to your device each morning, please see the link below. I've written these for about 28 years, and I think that's pretty unique amongst the YouTube astrologers. And that gives you an opportunity to connect with either your sun or your ascendant. You can have both if you choose, to give you just an overview of what's going on each day in your situation. Now, if you would like to understand how serious astrology is impacting on your personal situation, if you give me 3 pieces of your personal birth data, of time, date and place of birth, I can produce for you your life roadmap report, helping you to get a more intimate understanding of all the patterns that are working in your situation from when you were born. Some you may have mastered, some may still be causing some mischief. By understanding them better, that can help you to negotiate challenges but seize opportunities much more successfully. Also, in my special package, you can get your 12-month personal forecast, totally unique to you, and gain seeing insights. If you don't know your time, I've developed a special package based on the sun as the ascendant, very much in terms of your sun videos on YouTube. And that also can be really relevant for you. I really believe that. I'm not a natal astrologer, as I am, who scorns sun sign astrology. I think that they can coexist. So whether you're working through the prism of your ascendant or your sun, they're both providing some very important information. Not least, we've seen with Pluto moving in tropical astrology into the sign of Aquarius on the 23rd of March, a big discussion about artificial intelligence, and I have been predicting that for about the last 2 years. Of course, it's not that artificial intelligence hasn't developed until the 23rd of March. Of course it has, but it's really come into public view in such a powerful way. And of course it can be very good if it's going to spot disease quicker than the human eye or some previously unreliable tests. But there are going to be implications for personkind, the sign of Aquarius. It's about humanity, it's about the collective, and that's where this retrograde story begins. So if we think about the retrograde, and we also think about what Pluto is about, retrogrades are when we turn inwards. So if you have Pluto retrograde in your natal chart, which would be true for around about 40% of people, because each year Pluto will go through that retrograde for around about 5 months. So 40% of people are going to have a slightly more inward approach to transformation. 60% of people will still be influenced by Pluto, and of course it depends on the angles that Pluto, or aspects that Pluto is forging within your natal chart, including to your ascendant, 4th house, 7th house and 10th house, the angles themselves. But if we just take the concept of the introversion that the retrograde can bring in the sign of Aquarius, if you're born early in Aquarius, Taurus, Leo or Scorpio, this is having a massive impact. But that also could be true if you've got other personal planets or other big outer planets right on the early part of those fixed signs. But equally, if you have planets right at the end of the big cardinal signs, so right at the end of Aries, Cancer, Libra and Capricorn, you're equally going to be impacted by this retrograde in a big way. So first of all, let's explore the themes of Pluto more generally. Pluto is about transformation. In a more spiritual dimension, particularly if people have, say, something like Pluto trine the Sun in their natal chart, they're always going to be someone who's evolving in a very positive way, potentially. But equally, if Pluto is in a harsh aspect to something like Mars, which it is going to be over the next 5 months in 2 different instances, that can be much more to do with themes to do with domination, lust, assertion to a degree where one person may get a lot of what they need to the detriment of somebody else. Now this could also be argued that this can be like a societal influence. So what's the difference between Pluto and Aquarius, for example? The collective, person, kind, how we all interact, our highest hopes, our idealism, Aquarius, against the more established order, how things have been for a long time, the establishments, anything to do with big business, big government, big money, big corporations, very Pluto in Capricorn. And of course, as this retrograde begins, Pluto is in Aquarius at 21 degrees. So that's the first 2.5 degrees of each zodiac sign, the duad. Each zodiac sign is divided into 12 in the 12th harmonic approach to astrology. And that first 2.5 degrees is very redolent of the combination of the traditionality of Saturn and the progression and innovation of Uranus. And of course we've seen a lot of discussion about AI since Pluto moved into Aquarius on the 23rd of March. Did AI exist before? Yes. Was it being talked about before? Yes. Was it being talked about as much as it's been talked about since then? No. Because Pluto is raising our consciousness to the potential positive side of that. For example, identifying illness in a more accurate and speedy way, and the more delicate and perhaps challenging implications of how it can take away the role of humans, which I personally don't think is going to be a good thing. So that Pluto in Aquarius energy has already started to manifest itself hugely. But because the retrograde into the sign of Capricorn sees it reverse back just over 2 degrees, what does that last 2.5 degree slot of the 12th harmonic of Capricorn tell us? Well, that's actually governed by Sagittarius. Sagittarius is to do with philosophy, freedom, international affairs, borders, boundaries. And I think we are going to see the power of Pluto definitely play out around those particular themes within the theme. So Pluto, of course, can be about, in a positive way, transformation, truth, our inner journey. And some astrologers would argue that Pluto is very much to do with reincarnation. So where Pluto is in your natal chart will give you a lot of understanding, not just in terms of the zodiac sign, because obviously it moves so slowly. So a lot of people will have Pluto in Leo, lots of people in Virgo, and so on. The key is, of course, the house it's in, but also the aspect that's forged to that position. So, for example, in my chart, I have Mercury in a trine with Pluto, which is very much to do with analysis. But my Mercury is in Capricorn, so that's quite businesslike. It likes to be to the point and understand things in a very crisp and tangible way. That's how it works for me. But you could have somebody else who may have Pluto opposite a more difficult position, like the Sun, like Mercury, and that person could be very strident, very forceful in going for what they want. And the 5 big aspects that I'm about to outline to you do suggest that we are in for a tense period. And of course, we could say, blimey, Patrick, is there any more tension we can take? There's been so much with Saturn square with Uranus over the last couple of years. Well, that's the thing. Pluto has always been influential. You know, when we had the start of COVID, Pluto and Jupiter were side by side in Capricorn. Jupiter in its full. Pluto can be about death, also reincarnation, of course, and Jupiter can be about international affairs, but in the sign of Capricorn, we saw a contraction in the financial environment, the economic cycle, as we always do with Jupiter in Capricorn, but we also saw a big outbreak of a very challenging disease in the guise of COVID. So, some people would argue that the way governments try to control their individual movements was the orthodoxy and the tradition of Capricorn trying to limit Jupiter freedom through its rulership of Sagittarius. And other people would argue you have to have some rules and regulations in order to ensure our longer term freedoms. It depends on which side of that argument you personally stand. But that is how Jupiter and Pluto worked in that particular instance. And of course Saturn was in the mix as well. So a really mighty alliance that was truly challenging. So we can think about the transformation of Pluto. We can think about things like the underworld. We can think about the things that are hidden from us. But we can also see people use the thrust and desire of Pluto in a very positive way to help others, for example. So Pluto and Jupiter will often, in a positive alliance, give the individual a chance to use their vision, their enthusiasm, and the desire to create alterations in a way which can be helpful to many folks. Also, Pluto and Jupiter people, in a positive way, often end up pretty well off. However, control can be another one of the adjectives that we could hang on Pluto. So the retrograde is going to help us to think about our relationship to control, our own need for control, or where we may feel controlled, or where we may feel manipulated, or someone feels we're manipulating them. These themes are going to be played out over the next 5 months. And it's also important to understand, because of that more karmic side of Pluto, that some fated dimensions and events may unfold. And that could be really interesting. Or are there some behaviours that we need to look at and revisit and try to eliminate and rebirth ourselves in some way? So that's possible. But if there is something that you do feel controlled about in terms of, say, eating, something, it doesn't really matter whatever it is. If we're doing too much of it, it probably isn't entirely good for us, even if we enjoy it at some level. So that kind of obsessive compulsive behavior is something that we could try to challenge, especially if it is at some level a little bit destructive. But equally, there could be some huge revelations that are about to unfold on top of the many huge revelations we've had. But one of the things I love about Pluto, and I've seen this play out for a very long time, sometimes Pluto will create situations where it will take things away from us that we bitterly grieve at the time because we don't see why that happened. But in the fullness of time, we can see that Pluto was actually doing something that was good for us. Sometimes we will be very aware of trying to manage the change ourselves. We'll be very proactive rather than reacting to someone else's change that impacts upon us. And that's a very, very good thing. But if something does alter in your situation over the next 5 months, try to look at it as a spiritual journey. So we can try to cling on to the things that give us that sense of power, or we can go with the flow and understand that Pluto is something that does have a huge impact. And the more philosophical we can be about some of those changes that can come, the easier it will be. The more we resist them, the more painful it can be. Now, I want to just share with you briefly the event chart. In terms of that, you can see on the screen now that Pluto is in house 11 as this process begins. So we can think about the pushback that may start to happen around about the very AI. So there's been a lot of talk about it. Certain tech gurus are in favour, certain tech gurus are against it. Obviously people's jobs are being affected by this technology to some degree, and that's the thing that I think is scary, because I feel that gives us all a sense of purpose. But the midpoint between the sun and the moon is at 17 degrees in Cancer, so collectively that's house 4. That's very much to do with emotional security, and it is in a conjunction with Mars, which of course can be very challenging in the sign of Cancer, because it's a defensive energy here. It's in its full, but it's squaring up with Chiron. So Chiron in Aries is, I think, seeing us grappling for our identity. And I think that identity theme has been running since the 21st of March with the Aries new moon in a conjunction with Jupiter. Then we've, of course, had the solar eclipse, which again has had Jupiter in the mix, not quite as tight, but squaring up to Pluto. So the Jupiter-Pluto square has been manifesting for some while. But we can also see that we do have the moon in Virgo in an opposition with Neptune, and that can create distortion but also exhaustion. And I think it can make us hypersensitive to the realities of life as it is and how it's changing. And also with Gemini hosting Venus, because there's such a lot of energy in the sign of Taurus, very much about everyday money, and Venus rules that sign in a square with Neptune, that also can create some unreality. So we've got a T-square basically between Venus, the moon, and the position of Neptune. So our relating energies can feel a little bit moving, shifting, and not very solid. So it feels like our emotional foundations are in a state of flux, and of course all immutable signs. So that doesn't give us that sense of security, which is so important. Now the event chart sees the ascendant in Libra, but Pluto in the 4th house. So I think that feeds back into the narrative on the screen now. You can see the event chart in Placidus, based as usual with me on Greenwich and Universal Time. And you can see the square a little bit broad with Jupiter, but it's been ongoing and it's actually going to be in effect for the whole of May. But we also have in the event chart from the Placidus perspective, the midpoint between the Sun and the Moon in a conjunction with Mars in house 9. So that's the instability that I feel that we may see around international affairs as a reinforcement of that. Now the Moon, in its opposition with Neptune and its square with Venus, is in house 11, very much to do with, again, how we all link together. And Virgo can be about purity, health, and I feel the organisational side of things. So however much talk there is, and there probably, as usual, will be a lot of chatter on all the different social media platforms, I feel the potential for deception is strong. So we need to download with Pluto's retrograde in how we feel at a deeper level. Now, one of the things I've not shared with you so far is obviously the sign of Aquarius that's hosting Pluto as this event begins is very much about how we all interact with one another. It can be to do with how we plan our futures. It can also be to do with embracing technology that can be good for us. Not all technology is not good for us. And it's more to do with the governance, I feel, who has control, because we've seen with the internet, it has become a little bit like the Wild West. There may be the apparent concept through things like GDPR that there's some kind of controls or security in place, but we all know with all the scams that go around that they don't work, not in their totality. So what about the theme in Capricorn? Well, I feel that that's asking us to think about those international affairs, those higher philosophies through that duad of Sagittarius, but the more Capricornian side of that suggests we do need to think a lot about business, consumerism, the economic climate, and I think that together with Jupiter's retrograde, which will begin in September, there is going to continue to be a retraction, but it's not necessarily a retraction that doesn't have opportunities if we can modify our approach in some ways. Now, as this process begins, as I mentioned before, there is a square with Jupiter for the whole of May. So Jupiter and Pluto can lead to encountering people who have a particular philosophy that they feel that they can dispel to everyone else, and can use a lot of intellectual swiftness and dexterity in order to enlighten us all. But I think it's important to cut through the froth and try to understand what's really going on. Of course, Jupiter is going to move on the 16th into the sign of Taurus, and then on the 18th will be exactly square with Pluto in Aquarius. So that's pretty challenging for the whole of May. We also have on May the 21st an opposition between Mars and Pluto, but that starts to build up from the 15th to the 27th of May. That's a very warlike combination, I've just got to be honest there. What we're going to get essentially is the two rulers of the sign of Scorpio in opposition. So Pluto's about transformation, but power. Mars is about thrust. Can of course be warlike. It can be very reforming. It can show initiative and try to change things. But that combination of Pluto opposite Mars and Pluto in a square with Jupiter, wow, we're really talking about big stuff. So we need to hold on to our celestial hats. Essentially, the power potential of Pluto through its scorpionic influences, I feel really is going to reach a big peak. And unfortunately, what we can see with Pluto is those people who hold the levers of power can override the normal boundaries of decency and rules and regulations, Jupiter, to get what they want, because desire is absolutely at a peak, but desire in some ways to dominate. So we could see some big stuff perhaps around Taiwan, perhaps we're going to see some stuff in the Ukraine, the counter-offensive maybe, and it's going to be potentially explosive, I feel. But we're also going to see from the 2nd of June to the 9th of June an opposition between Pluto and Venus. Now this is as Venus comes to the end of its journey in the sign of Cancer, which can be good for taking care of our home situation and being more nurturing, or wanting to do some decorative improvements, family gatherings or reunions. But I think also Pluto in an opposition to Venus can be where someone flatters us, uses the charm and the superficiality of Venus's rulership of Libra, potentially, but they have a motive. The deeper motive is to achieve something, and it could be a sexual motive, it could be a financial motive. So if someone's flattering you hugely at the start of June, you may enjoy every single moment, but just be conscious of what you may be getting into. Then we have Pluto in an opposition with the Sun. So this is really potent, and that reaches a peak on July the 22nd. Obviously the Sun is what gives us all our burning energy to succeed and to continue to move forwards. It's very dynamic. So what we can have here, people who have Pluto opposite Sun in their natal horoscopes, can be very much might is right people. Very strident, need to get their own way, don't really care too much about who they may upset in the process. Just be aware you could meet someone who's very dominated, or you may find someone pushing back if they feel that you're in some ways trying to impose your will on them. So watch out for that one. And then in October itself, we have the second Mars-Pluto influence, this one a square, and that's from the 3rd of October to the 11th, and it becomes exact on the 9th, just before Pluto goes direct. Now, because Mars is right at the end of Libra by this time, of course Mars in Libra is in full. So you can see that we have Mars in two flawed locations. Initially, as it's in its late location in the sign of Cancer, in an opposition to Pluto on a disassociate basis, before it moves into Leo on the 20th of May. But the influence starts on the 15th, so that's when it's in its full. And then in the sign of Libra, when we go from the 3rd of October through to the 11th, that's actually in detriment. So we've got a weakened Mars, and it's going to be interesting to see how it stands up to Pluto, which will get the upper hand, if you like. So of course initially it's going to be Pluto in Aquarius, which is asking us to find the best version of ourselves, and then it's in the sign of Capricorn, which is asking us to engage with our desire to have possessions and material benefits of life, but we can't have a detachment from how what we get may impact on someone else who doesn't have some of the advantages that we have. So anything to do with entitlement, I think, is going to be very much to the fore, because the sign of Libra very much about fairness, and that's where we're going to be as Pluto goes direct on the 11th of October. Now, please stay with me as I go through each of the 12 zodiac signs to give you a flavour of what you can expect in these next 5 months. So Aries, for you, this is an opportunity, particularly if you're born early in your sign, to think about the type of connections you want, especially in terms of your professional situation. Do you want to work in an environment where you're going to be appreciated, where you feel that there's some kind of value to what you do? You're more invested in exactly what you're involved with, not just seeing it as a job. Those are the things that could play out over the next 5 months. If you're born later, towards the end of Aries, I think this can be a more challenging transit for you. You are going to be asked to think a lot about what your role in life is, but I think it could be that some big transformation is in the works, and it may not be easy to resist that. So it's going to be less about the social dimension for you, and I feel it's going to be more about the realities of how things are altering for you. But in general, for Aries people, I feel that the more material plane that has dominated with Pluto since 2008 is something we all need to take a little bit of a rain check around. And that deeper thinking can actually see you emerge in October with a much clearer understanding of what your identity should be or needs to be in terms of your connection to the wider world. So Taurus, for you, there could be a pull towards some kind of training, education or travel between now and the 11th of October. But the travel can be from the comforts of your home. It can all be to do with your philosophies, your outlook, your ideals. It can go through quite the transformation. But if you are involved in any kind of situation to do with a contract or the law, maybe things will require quite a bit of patience, particularly if you're born more towards the end of your sign. And of course with Jupiter moving into Taurus, but squaring up with Pluto for the whole of May, this is a time when your steady approach to situations can be very valuable to you, because Jupiter in your sign is going to be a more considered approach. It's not going to be so gung-ho as it can be through its more Sagittarius dimension. But I think if around a professional situation things are changing, you may need to consider reskilling or using past experiences and skills in a fresh way or new environment. So Gemini, ever since Pluto moved into the sign of Aquarius on the 23rd of March, I actually feel you've had quite the platform to project your ideas, learn new information, update your philosophies. It's been really quite exciting. It's not to say that's going to stop, but I feel it just becomes more introspective. But once Pluto moves in its retrograde on the 11th of June into your 8th house, you're back into a territory which dominated your situation since 2008. In terms of the 8th house, in a practical, pragmatic way, we're talking about things like insurances, pensions, investments, property matters, can be to do with legacies and inheritances. And I feel you could put in place the instruments to deal with your situation to protect those that are important to you. But also you could be thinking about how you can extract a little bit more from the resources you do have. So maybe squeezing something out, cashing in something, moving things around, some kind of transformation in those more physical dimensions is possible. In terms of the more inward side of Pluto in the 8th house, obviously our own mortality is a very sensitive subject, but that's what the 8th house does relate to. If you're someone who's very at peace with this, very accepting that, we are going through this life, but there may potentially be another life, or you're someone who doesn't even believe that, but still it's not something that fills you with particular sense of dread, then you're probably going to deal with this retrograde very comfortably. If you're someone who, like many people, finds the whole concept a little more challenging, then perhaps that can be an area that you can explore to see how perhaps your apprehensions about change in general may need to have a light shone upon them. So for some Gemini people, you could be thinking about rooting out some approaches. The 8th house, very much the root that are no longer working for you, or confronting some of the roots of past influences or incidents that may still be quite active in your being and persona in the here and now. Cancer, for you, well, Pluto has had quite the impact on your sector of relationships since 2008. Were you happy about how all the outcomes played out? Pluto can be about ruthlessness, and it's possible that perhaps something occurred during that period of years where you felt that you had to assert your rights, your authority, and you made a decision perhaps to finish a relationship. And if you did that in a way that you felt was for the right reasons, and you explained your reasons, or you went through a process of negotiation before you felt you had no choice, I don't think you've got anything to reproach yourself about at all. But if maybe your decision was rather hasty or forceful, or looking back on it even a little bit unjust, you could find yourself really working your way through some of the decisions you made and really thinking carefully, were they quite what you would make now? So there could be some very deep reflection around your relationships. And with Jupiter coming into your longer term future sector, I feel that relationships in general need to be those that you feel there's a high level of cooperation and collaboration. But because of the cusp that Pluto is going to be sitting on between the 7th and the 8th houses, it's possible that any friendship or involvement that isn't flowing quite as well, there isn't a fair distribution between your needs and the other person's needs, that could lead to some politics around your relationships during this time. But also Pluto in retrograde in the 7th house can think about your connections to people and where you want to reach a greater sense of collaboration, but that may require you to forego a little bit of your tendency for control. So a little bit more trust may be calling out to you as an opportunity with Pluto's retrograde. Now Leo, for you, Pluto retrograde initially in Aquarius is about a relationship. As it moves back into Capricorn, it's about practicalities. How do you balance the practicalities with Jupiter moving into the most visible part of your situation in the 10th house? So I feel there needs to be a balance. Your professional relationships are going to be important. If there's a lot of you giving but not a lot of you getting, and your personal freedoms are compromised, that's going to be important to you. So this can be a time also where you're going to think very deeply about your physical health, how you could perhaps improve things, restructure your life in a positive way. A change of job could occur, but I feel the job front for you really needs to be interesting and exciting. It's not just about being workaday and committed, providing a service. Virgo, for you, Pluto initially reverses in your 6th house, where of course Saturn has been for the last couple of years. Maybe depending on where your planets or the sun is in your sign, this impact of Pluto retrograde could be felt more once it reverses back into Capricorn, which is your 5th house. Any politics around a romantic situation or your talents are going to peak again between now and the 21st of January next year. So if you're in a situation where you feel you make a lot of sacrifices, but by doing so you're suppressing your love of enjoying things or creativity, that may be something you need to think again about. Libra, Pluto moving back into the 4th house from the 11th of June is not something I necessarily think that you will favour. Perhaps this is like a refresher course for all the lessons learnt since 2008. Perhaps you've had a little taste of a romantic interaction since Pluto's been in the sign of Aquarius. You quite liked it. You know, it's something that has been intriguing, exciting, flirty, perhaps even something more romantic. But it's all about how things feel. So you're being asked to make sure that you're not bending over backwards to please other people. You're staying upright to be flexing and available for others, but also staying in touch with what you truly need as an emotional being, and that is the refresher course. Scorpio, for you, Pluto, your ruler, rewinding initially in your 4th house. If you're not very happy where you live, or in an emotional relationship or the family dynamics, they're really going to be highlighted now. But once Pluto inverses back into the sign of Capricorn, it's about everyday communication. Your way of thinking, your belief systems, your way of expressing yourself could be challenged between now and the 21st of January next year, but particularly round to when the retrograde begins. So you're being asked to rethink, perhaps, or review some of your beliefs and some of your interaction with people around you on an everyday basis. And you could find yourself also rethinking your mode of transport. Ironically, it's true. Pluto can be about, of course, where we get our power. If you're someone who gets a lot of power from telling people about your version of events, and I'm not being unkind, a lot of us like to express our enthusiasm for a particular topic, but if it's dominating other people by doing so, that's where a rethink may be necessary. Sagittarius, obviously because your ruler Jupiter is squaring up with Pluto for the whole of May, big month for you. Jupiter moving from 5 to 6, mid-month. That goes from creativity to practicality. Pluto moves from house 3 to house 2. So finances have been a sticky area for Sagittarian people, or is it your self-worth or your validation since 2008? So you may need to have another look at that through the summer months, through to October. But see it as an opportunity as well. The second house also can be about what we consume. So you may decide to start a diet to eliminate sugars or something that's not particularly good for you. So anything to do with money or excesses that are propping you up, but not because they're particularly enjoyable. It's almost like you have to have them, you're craving for them, but that might be because your self-worth isn't quite as robust as it could be. That's the theme. Capricorn, for you, having Pluto moving back into your sign really does depend on where you have the sun or other influences in the sign of Capricorn. So if you're born towards the end of Capricorn, you're in for quite the journey between now and October. You're really being asked to transform your whole way of being. That may mean that you have a lot of physical energy and drive to achieve things, but it also can make you potentially vulnerable to some changes, and it depends what house the sun might be in. If that was the case, if you're born earlier on into Capricorn, it's another opportunity to see how some of the things you set in play in 2008 are doing. Are you so caught up in your own identity and ego that that's something that's not quite working? Are you identifying too much with your exterior and not enough with your interior world? That's the lesson for Capricorn. Aquarius, well, interesting stuff. The inversion from your sign to the sign of Capricorn brings that psychological stuff really back into focus again. But again, if you really worked with Pluto since 2008 and did a lot of self-analysis, perhaps had counselling, had a lot of exposure to healing, became a healer yourself, opened up about some of your pain and trauma and anxieties, then maybe you've worked with Pluto very successfully already. So for you, again, this depends exactly where the sun is. If your sun is more towards the end of Aquarius, maybe is that this actually can be quite a comforting influence in a way, because it's helping you to think more about your connections in a longer term context, which is very Aquarius. But if you're born more towards the start of Aquarius, like I am, this is very much the psychological dimension. So important to look after yourself, not try to use your intellect to, in some ways, offset some of the inner stuff that may be going on that's very, very deep. And so you could find you're wanting to get in touch with some very, very powerful past hurts, bring them up to the surface and release them. Releasing any past pain would be a magnificent thing to do between now and October the 11th. For Pisces, well, Pluto moving into your 11th house is all about your connections to others. It's your social world. It can be your longer term plan, but of course you have Saturn now in your sign rather than the 12th house. So I feel that this will be more comfortable than when Pluto was in the sign of Capricorn before, when Saturn was in Aquarius. So I feel that there's a lot to go on this. If you're someone who is a little bit wary of connecting to people, you want to maintain your individuality, that's totally understandable. The 11th house can be about that. But also, we also need to realise that we are all connected. So if you're trying to not be connected for some reason, perhaps to reinforce your world with material success, Capricorn, in order to feel that you're good enough to mix or be with people or associate, that's the type of attitudes and ways of being that Pluto's asking you to tackle. It's asking you to be more in touch with all of our collective frailties, to not see your wound as being such a threat to you, and perhaps forgive and forget some things that have happened around your friendship circle, or around some of the ways that people may have let you down, or your perceived feeling of being let down. But again, it depends on where you are in Pisces. For example, if Saturn is sitting on your sun, or has done since it moved into your sign on the 7th of March, your focus may be very much on Saturn, narrowing your focus, really eliminating things that are not working for you. And this stuff is much more to do with how you connect to others, and that may seem a bit more of a frippery. But with Jupiter in the 3rd house, you will be connecting to others, even if it may not be what you consciously think is right for you. You will, because you've got something to say that's important, but you need to get rid of all the things that aren't important for the message to be pure enough. And then once it is, even without wanting to or needing to, you just will connect to others. It just will be. It's been a real pleasure being with you. Thank you so much for joining me, and wishing you all of the best. Please like, comment or subscribe.